From our earliest days, fighting to save the wetlands from development, our founder, Ruth Lansford, knew that saving the wetlands was only half the battle, and restoring the wetlands was just as important. And this is why we worked with local, state, and federal authorities to improve the tide gates on Ballona Creek, a project completed in 2004. This critical stopgap measure brought life back to the salt marsh and increased habitat for the endangered Belding savanna sparrow. This cryptic bird forages and nests in the pickleweed habitat, which you will only find where there is tidal flow. And that's why we fought for the restoration of the freshwater marsh and the riparian corridor nearby, which today provides critical habitat for a number of rare and endangered birds. And while we wait for the state's planned restoration of the Ballona Wetlands, Friends of Ballona Wetlands has been practicing what we preach for more than 25 years through our community-based habitat restoration program. Beginning in 1994, we started to restore 8 acres of sand dune habitat on the western edge of the reserve. Over time, we were able to bring back a thriving dune system. And every year, we see about 3,000 participants from schools, businesses, families, Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, high school, college, you name it, they come out to help restore Ballona. And community-based restoration is slow and painstaking and involves a lot of weeding, removing invasive plants by hand, and planting native seeds and plants in its place. But the cumulative effort of all of these community members results in amazing things, like the return of the endangered El Segundo blue butterfly, first documented in our restoration sites in 2011, and seen there every year since. These programs create a connection to place and strengthen the community and provide a deeper understanding of local ecology and the mental health benefits of spending time immersed in nature. Community-based restoration is a powerful tool. And while it can't achieve all of our goals envisioned in the larger restoration plan, after 25 years, we still are working on the same 8 acres of sand dunes. It will always have a role to play in restoring habitat and connecting people with nature. So now we can get into the large-scale restoration effort that's going to take place at the ecological reserve. So California Fish and Wildlife and the Army Corps of Engineers are finalizing plans for the long-awaited full-scale restoration. And we are not speaking on behalf of CDFW or the Army Corps, but we're speaking as advocates for restoration. And everything that is presented here is substantiated in the EIR or other scientific sources. And we are advocates along with numerous other environmental organizations, especially within the Wetlands Restoration Principles Coalition, where we are a founding member. And we're all together advocating for a robust, science-based restoration that meets the 9 restoration principles created by the coalition. And the other highly respected organizations pictured here are our partners on the steering committee of that coalition. During this presentation, I'll discuss why wetlands are important, which I'm sure you all know, provide an overview of the history of Ballona and how it has been impacted. We'll describe the project goals, alternatives, and outcomes. And lastly, we'll give some restoration examples, talk about how you can support our efforts, and answer any questions. So why wetlands are important? I feel I'm preaching to the choir here, but of course they have numerous ecosystem and community benefits. So they provide biological diversity, genetic resilience, they clean our water, prevent floods, store carbons, produce oxygen, on. And then including, they also have significant cultural value, support local industries, and are great places for recreation. Unfortunately, wetlands have been lost in staggering amounts, and I'm sure you all know that 95% of wetlands in California have been lost. The Ballona wetlands themselves have been greatly reduced in size due to development and degradation. They once spanned over 2,000 acres. So the protection of the wetlands as an ecological reserve is a success story in saving approximately 600 of those acres as open space. As the only coastal wetland left in the city of Los Angeles and one of the few remaining in the Santa Monica Bay area, it is critical to the region that we have protected this space. For those who aren't familiar with the area, over here is what we call West Area B. So the pictures from the sand dunes is right over here where my cursor is. And this is the area where the tide gates were opened up to allow some muted tidal flow, and some of that also makes its way down here. Otherwise, everything else is cut off from tidal flow and from the creek entirely. This over here is at the corner of Lincoln and Jefferson Boulevard, is the restored freshwater marsh, which I also mentioned, and the adjacent riparian corridor. So these capture stormwater, treat the water that runs off from the streets, and provides habitat. These two areas are managed separately. So this is the ecological reserve over here, and then this is the freshwater marsh and corridor, which are maintained by another entity. So Ballona's history is a long one, but in recent history, starting in 1984, Friends of Ballona Wetlands sued to prevent the remaining wetlands from being developed. The battle was long, but with the support of elected officials in the community, in 2003, the state officially acquired the land for $140 million, with the purpose of protecting and restoring the wetlands. Planning and research for restoration began soon after, with the final environmental impact report being released late last year. After certification and completion of the comparable EIS from the Army Corps of Engineers, the permitting process will begin, followed by restoration work, long-term monitoring, and maintaining the land. Here is an animation that takes us through Ballona's transformation over the last several thousand years. As you can see, Ballona has changed quite a lot, from an open bay to a partially closed tidal system. And one of the biggest changes occurred when the Los Angeles River was rerouted after a massive flood in the early 1800s. So here you can see the LA River was merging with Ballona Creek and emptying into the Santa Monica Bay. But after the massive flood, it rerouted and now travels to Long Beach. So freshwater influence in Ballona was greatly reduced at this point. And even more so after channelization here, where the creeks were straightened and cemented and extensive urbanization began in the 1900s. Here it is with the Hughes Airfield, and this is Ballona today. A map of the historic Ballona Lagoon from 1876 shows a mixture of vegetated salt and brackish marsh, salt pans, tidal channels, and open water. And inland from there were alkali meadows, wet meadows, and willow thickets. At this point in time, remember, the LA River no longer flowed to Ballona. Historic photos show a similar picture of vegetation with meandering tidal channels surrounded in pickleweed, typical of coastal California salt marshes. This first image compares 1934 to 2017. This second image shows the area just before Marina del Rey was developed. And if for anyone who's familiar with the area, the pond in the lower left-hand side is what is now considered Mother's Beach. The Ballona wetlands have suffered over the years. In the 1800s, farming began, hunting lodges and resorts and railroads were constructed. Then in the 1900s, Ballona suffered from additional serious negative impacts, including oil drilling, channelization of Ballona Creek, which dewatered the wetlands and disconnected the land from the water, dredging and filling to create Marina del Rey, which permanently destroyed nearly half of the wetland system, approximately 900 acres. And to make matters worse, fill from dredging the marina was dumped on the remaining wetlands, further disconnecting the land from the water and raising the land by 15 to 20 feet, burying the historic wetland and promoting invasive species. Ballona continues to suffer from numerous impacts, including altered hydrology, bisection by roads, pollution from trash and contaminated water, as well as noise and light pollution from surrounding urbanization. Also, an onslaught of invasive vegetation and urban predators, such as cats and raccoons. The wetlands are not thriving, and numerous scientific studies show that conditions are getting worse. This map shows a transition that in just 6 years, invasive plants have expanded their range in the reserve to dominate many areas, shown here in orange and red, especially the areas with altered hydrology, creating large swaths of monocultures of weeds. And now in 2020, the situation in some areas has become even worse. Again, the situation is so extensive that it's going to take a massive effort to undo this damage. Let's take a look at Area A. Some degraded and isolated seasonal non-tidal salt marsh and coastal sage scrub persisted through the 1990s. However, now in 2020, the former wetland area is dried and almost unrecognizable. The coastal sage scrub is isolated and disappearing under invasive weeds. This area has become so degraded and altered that restoration with shovels and rakes, like Friends of Ballona Wetlands has been doing in the dunes, just isn't going to work here, especially with the cement levees blocking off all the water. Many of these monocultures occur in the most isolated and fragmented areas with the most altered hydrology, like East Area B, trapped between two roads, Area A, bordered by roads and cement on all sides, Area C, the most inland and disconnected area. These areas are overcome with fields of invasive plants like crown daisy, black mustard, euphorbia, and ice plant. These plants outcompete native plants, and they provide little or no resources for native wildlife. For example, 80% of caterpillars depend solely on native plants, and caterpillars are an essential food source for birds raising chicks. The Ballona Wetlands Ecological Reserve is currently closed to the public, but could potentially be a gem of a park with exceptional wildlife viewing and recreational and educational opportunities for communities that have very little access to the outdoors. Currently, 3 organizations are permitted by Fish and Wildlife to lead programs at the reserve: Friends of Ballona Wetlands, the Bay Foundation, and Los Angeles Audubon. A restored Ballona will have high-quality habitat and a system of trails that will provide expanded educational programming and access, as well as critical open space to over 15,000 disadvantaged communities within just a short driving distance. As you can see in this image, the area around Ballona currently has a high park need according to the LA County Park Needs Assessment. The areas in red have a high park need, and the restoration of the wetlands would help address that. In fact, Westchester, Playa del Rey, and the Los Angeles and the LAX area are the most park-poor neighborhoods of the West Side, with only 15% of the population within walking distance of a park. In general, green space has numerous benefits for communities, but also increases property values in the surrounding area and improves the health of folks living nearby. Does anybody have any questions before we move on to describing the project? No? Okay. So now that we've identified all the many reasons why Ballona needs a robust and science-based restoration, let's talk about the goals of the project. As an ecological reserve, the first and primary goal is to create high-quality habitat for wildlife by restoring Ballona to a fully functioning, biologically diverse estuary. The second primary goal is to provide benefits to humans, such as beautiful views, recreational value, and a place to educate the next generation of environmental stewards. The EIR outlines 3 project alternatives and 1 no project alternative. Alternative 1 is the most extensive restoration. Alternative 2, slightly less so, and alternative 3 limits restoration to primarily Area A. The no project alternative does not include any enhancements to the reserve, but must be included by law. As a coalition, we endorsed a modified version of alternative 1 with extra protections before proceeding to the second phase. We're going to focus on alternative 1 because it is the most extensive, and impacts and changes from alternative 2 and 3 would be to a lesser extent and are therefore included in alternative 1. Alternative 1 creates and enhances the largest wetland acreage and proceeds in 2 phases. Phase 1 would last about 5 years, and phase 2 would last about 3 years, with a waiting period in between for wildlife to adjust. And we don't know yet which alternative Fish and Wildlife has chosen. We're waiting for certification to find out. Alternative 1 would restore native habitat for wildlife by removing non-native invasive plants and replacing them with native plants appropriate to the habitat type. This will increase breeding and foraging opportunities for native wildlife populations, especially for sensitive wetland species, and a few of which are pictured here. Species that previously called Ballona home will be able to return, and species that are still hanging on will benefit from improved and expanded habitat. Endangered species habitat is protected to the greatest extent possible, and any habitat that is lost will be mitigated for and expanded elsewhere in the project. Alternative 1 will also reconnect Ballona estuary to its floodplain by removing the concrete levees and allowing water to flow naturally. This is critical as hydrology is the most important component of a wetland. This project will require the use of heavy machinery to undo the damage done by building Marina del Rey, specifically to remove cement levees, excavate excessive fill and sediment, and recreate tidal channels. Essentially, we have to unbulldoze Ballona. Construction will take place in phases to allow for wildlife to move to other areas. A biologist will oversee the work to reduce impacts on wildlife. Machinery like this has been used successfully in countless other wetland restoration projects, including at Bolsa Chica. To fulfill the second primary goal of the project, Alternative 1 will create trails, bike paths, and educational opportunities for the public. These amenities will make the reserve wheelchair accessible and provide parking for visitors who live outside the immediate area, as well as bus parking for schools. Furthermore, CDFW wardens will patrol the well-regulated trails to reduce impacts and maintain safety. Paths near sensitive breeding areas may be closed part of the year to protect wildlife. Trails and bike paths will be placed on the periphery of the reserve to minimize disturbance. And some areas will be left without trails to provide visitor-free areas for wildlife. This alternative adds 5.5 miles of bike trails and 2,000 feet of boardwalk, in addition to other pedestrian trails. SoCalGas operates a natural gas storage facility in Playa del Rey. Much of the storage is 6,000 feet below the wetlands, and there are currently monitoring wells and roads located on the reserve. The alternative includes abandonment of all 16 wells within the reserve, including removal of related access roads and infrastructure, which planners fought hard to achieve. This is a huge win for Ballona since SoCalGas owns the mineral rights underneath the wetlands and doesn't have to leave if they don't want to. This decision allows CDFW to maximize wetland habitat acreage and connectivity in the restoration plan. The well abandonment process started last month with what they call Viter 5 along Culver Boulevard. Up to 6 monitoring wells may be re-drilled on SoCalGas's property adjacent to the reserve to maintain their monitoring regulatory requirements. And these activities are managed by the California Public Utilities Commission and California Geologic Energy Management Division. Alternative 1 is the only alternative that adequately adapts to sea level rise. As the ocean rises, marsh habitat can transition to higher elevations. CDFW and the Army Corps are collaborating to design earthen levees around the perimeter of the reserve that will maintain or increase flood capacity. This is critical to providing marsh habitat for the Belding savanna sparrow and other wetland-dependent species into the future. If Ballona cannot adapt to sea level rise, they will lose their habitat. The Southern California Wetlands Recovery Project Regional Strategy Report from 2018 identifies the Santa Monica subregion as having the lowest opportunity for preserving wetlands in the face of climate change and sea level rise. And this is due to habitat loss and surrounding urbanization. Therefore, Ballona being the only large wetland area other than Malibu Lagoon in the area, it's critical to providing any wetland coastal resilience to this location. Carbon sequestration is an important tool in fighting climate change. Storing carbon in the soil is a natural process of wetlands, and studies focused on Ballona specifically found that carbon sequestration would increase by a minimum of 270% after restoration. There will be some greenhouse gas emissions from the restoration through machinery, trucks, and soil disturbance, and it will take many years for this restoration to offset those emissions. However, the EIR found that greenhouse gas emissions from earth-moving activities are less than significant from a regulatory standpoint, and the climate benefits of buffering sea level rise and storm surge are incredibly important. As can be seen by this graph, wetlands sequester much more carbon than uplands. In fact, studies show that the rate of carbon sequestration in coastal wetlands is greater than in all terrestrial forests combined, despite forests covering a much larger area. So yes, wetlands are better than trees at sequestering carbon. Numerous sources identify wetland restoration as vital to the fight against climate change. The Climate Reality Project says coastal habitat restoration alone could mitigate for the emissions from 5 million cars, and that reconnecting coastal marshes to their respective bodies of water not only will capture more carbon, but also eliminate 1/3 of global methane emissions. In the United States, roughly 27% of salt marshes are disconnected from the ocean and are prone to freshwater inundation, which releases methane. This happens because of the lack of sulfates in fresh water, changes the way bacteria in the soil breaks down plant life, and this new process produces methane as a result. For those worried about the timing of all of this, Ramsar International Convention on Wetlands explains that restored coastal marshes begin accumulating carbon almost immediately at rates equivalent to natural reference sites. Some temporary impacts will occur, but will be mitigated in a number of ways to reduce disturbance to the community. Some of those are listed here on this slide, but I know most of you don't live in the area. Here is a visualization from the EIR to show a view change that will take place in Area A, which again is the most degraded area on site. Levees will be breached, elevation will be lowered, channels will be created, native wetland plants will be added, and pedestrian boardwalks will be installed. Here is East Area B. Bridges that are built to move dirt within the project site will be repurposed into bike paths, and non-native plants will be replaced with native plants. Here is Area B South. It's a little hard to tell, but additional channels will be added to restore more natural hydrology. The tide will remain muted rather than full, and the adjacent freshwater marsh will allow for excess water to spill over and create a brackish marsh. Here is Area C North. The view now is of dead weeds throughout most of the year, but restoration will replace non-native weeds with beautiful native plants, and walking trails will be added, and any hills will be set far back from the buildings to preserve aesthetic. The Ballona Freshwater Marsh is one of Friends of Ballona Wetlands' biggest success stories. This is a panoramic transition of the freshwater marsh, which was restored using heavy machinery in a former lima bean field to create what is now one of the top birding hotspots in Los Angeles County. With more than 260 species seen since restoration began in 2003. Restoration takes time, but as the marsh matures, new bird species visit and some stay to breed, including special status species, such as the least-billed vireo that was brought back to Ballona by the creation of the riparian corridor adjacent to the marsh. And just this year, we had our first ever yellow-breasted chat nest at the freshwater marsh. Numerous successful restoration projects across California are highlighted on the Wetlands Restoration Principles Coalition, including the SoCal projects like Malibu Lagoon, your very own Bolsa Chica Wetlands, the San Alejo Lagoon, and also Northern California projects like San Pablo Bay, and the largest tidal wetland restoration taking place on the West Coast, the South Bay Salt Ponds Restoration. Here's a transition of the San Diego Lagoon near San Diego. It looks shocking, but we use this image to show that heavy machinery can be a real tool in fighting to bring back wetlands. In summary, the Ballona Wetlands Ecological Reserve will benefit greatly from improved habitats and biodiversity, as well as increased public access and safety patrols, enhanced climate change resiliency, scenic beauty, and protections for endangered species. And what you can do to support this process is to have your organization sign on to the Wetlands Restoration Principles Coalition. I encourage everyone to sign Ballona Wetlands support letter for restoration at ballonafriends.org/support. To contact your representatives, local, county, and state to say you want more wetland restoration in California, including at Ballona. To continue to volunteer with this amazing organization, and to spread the information that you've learned here today to counter any misinformation that's being shared. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me speak. and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, I have a couple of comments to make. You know, I've been dealing in different roles over the course of years with Ballona. Way back when I was on the Coastal Commission in the 1970s, it was a very different kind of circumstance. And then after I left the commission, spending many, many days and hours with Ruth Lansford and a few other folks dealing with litigation and planning issues over the years, I'm really impressed with what, in fact, you've been able to do. And so I have my fingers crossed as things go forward. As recently as earlier today, some of the usual suspects who have been critical of what goes on at Ballona were making a presentation before the Coastal Commission complaining about what you folks were up to. And so, among other things, I think they made reference to some ongoing litigation currently. So if you can tell us a little bit about the context of what's going on in terms of the squabble and fight, that might be informative.
Sure. Thank you for your support over the years. And yeah, we always love to remember Ruth and all of the accomplishments that she's brought about for us.
Well, I hope we're not just remembering her. She was still kicking
yes,
alive last time I checked.
Absolutely. We wouldn't be here without her. So we're so glad. So I guess the biggest thing that's going on right now, I would say, is that there's a lot of sound barriers and machinery out in the wetlands right now because SoCalGas is starting to abandon their wells. And the rumors that are going around is that they're actually drilling there instead of what they're doing, which is removing or abandoning the wells and removing the related infrastructure. So it's kind of hard to counter that. I mean, because it's just the fact versus the fiction. And we have a fact versus fiction flyer that talks about a lot of the talking points that the opposition brings up. But that's probably the biggest one right now. There's a conflation between the SoCalGas situation and the storage facility that everyone wants to move away from greenhouse gases. And of course, we need to do that. Climate change is here and roaring. We think that the restoration is part of the solution. And unfortunately, CDFW doesn't have any control over whether or not SoCalGas gets to stay. And so the two issues of the restoration and the storage facility, whether or not it stays, are completely separate, but they're getting mingled together. And so folks are making it seem like if you're for the restoration, then you're also pro-gas and pro-fossil fuels, which is obviously not the case. But that seems to be something that's being used as a talking point.
Okay.
I had a question about the cost of the restoration and how long is it supposed to take and who's paying for it?
So we don't know which alternative they're doing yet, and there could be a combination. So we're not sure. But if they choose alternative one, the estimate was $180 million. And the funding for that has yet to be identified because they can't source the funding until they certify the EIR, though there are already elements set up to take care of that, such as Prop 1 and Measure W. So there are pockets of money that are put aside for wetland restoration and stormwater storage and things like that. So that's where we'll anticipate that the funds will come from, a mixture of local, state, and federal public funds.
I mean, ideally, how long is it going to take?
Yes. So the best case scenario of when it will start will be in 3 years. The less optimistic scenario is 5 or 6. And if they go with alternative one, the first phase is 5 years. The second phase is 3 years. and there's a waiting period of at least 1 year in between. So altogether, it could take 9 years to complete, but maybe more if they have to wait longer between the 2 phases. And hopefully that'll start in 3 years.
Okay, I have a question, Neysa. Hi.
Hi, Cindy.
So there are obviously wetlands left in Southern California, and there has been restoration in many of them, and you showed some of those. And of course, there's Bolsa Chica. But due to the approach to these restorations, Area A has got seasonal freshwater marshes documented. There's been fairy shrimp sighted there by MRCA, among other things. It's lots of freshwater favored species there. I see an elderberry tree when I ride my bike past Area A. There's salt flats present, and salt marsh in Area A, and there's also freshwater habitat Area C. When you break down the levees, that area will, as you're saying, be connected with the creek. However, the creek up till about 1.5 miles, 2 miles in is saltwater tidal primarily. Open water mudflat wetland in Southern California has an increase by 615%. Salt marsh has decreased by 12%, salt flat by 90%, and freshwater brackish by 54%. So I'm wondering, my question is, we are going to be flooding habitat that is there and making it open water mudflat, and there's already been a huge increase, 615% of open water mudflat and restored marshes up and down the coast. So I'm wondering why that seems like a good plan to destroy this habitat that exists and create habitat of which there is abundance in what is left of wetlands in Southern California.
Okay.
So, I know it's a long-winded question.
No, thank you for your question. So I might have a long-winded answer.
Okay.
If that's appropriate. So Area A does have some remaining pockets of habitat, but it is disappearing every day. The amount of mustard, crown daisy, ice plant cover out there is horrifying. And so if something isn't done to do restoration or protect wetlands, anything that's left, it's going to continue to degrade. Ballona has one of the lowest wetland quality scores, CRAM scores in California. And so the goal of the project is not simply just to protect the small pockets of wetlands or seasonal wetlands or coastal sage scrub that's managed to hang on over these decades that it hasn't been protected adequately, but to actually make it thrive as one interconnected ecosystem with a bunch of different biological diversity elements. So lots of different kinds of habitats as opposed to just one predominant, right? So we're looking at is that we're maximizing the biological diversity, and we can't do that if you're trying to save like one little section over here, and then there's, oh, this little patch over here is pretty good. Like because it's one space, right? And so that's what the project looks at it like is, okay, if we're gonna lose this patch of seasonal freshwater wetland here, we find another place to recreate it where it's closer to an already like high quality area. So in southern Area B, there's a huge swath of willows that are doing really well, and they're expanding the restoration there. So that helps compensate for some areas that are going to lose some of their fresh water. And the goal overall is to adapt to sea level rise and to provide salt marsh habitat for the endangered species like the Belding Savannah sparrow that has nowhere else to go. And by allowing the habitat to migrate up along the earthen levees, then hopefully we still get to keep that species. To your point about losing freshwater vegetated wetlands, I think that there's a lot more opportunity to restore freshwater wetlands inland, whereas we only have so much coast left. So we have to prioritize our coastal wetlands for title, and then we can get together and find places throughout Los Angeles that we can bring back some really nice freshwater wetland areas. So, you know, thinking of it like a whole ecosystem.
Right. So, but there's also planned increased tidal flow in South Area B, where you just mentioned those great willows. So, are there any concerns about saltwater incursion impacting those willows? And also, although it's introduced, there is that huge eucalyptus grove where owls. It's an owl nursery for the great horned owl. So, what about what will incursion impact those areas? Do you think?
So we submitted in our comment that we were worried about that, and
Good.
SoCalGas responded that they would look at that and rethink where they dredge the channels to make sure that it's not going to impact any freshwater dependent vegetation that's there. And we're continuing to urge that because similar thing is going to happen in Northwest Area B, right? There's riparian area over there that we're working to maintain. So absolutely, and the eucalyptus grove is protected. It's not being, none of those trees or groves is being removed. But yeah, we're concerned about saltwater intrusion, and so they're accommodating with the channels that way. And then also the freshwater marsh, which was always designed to be connected to the ecological reserve, will finally have its last purpose fulfilled, so that it can release freshwater. And that'll help revitalize those willows as well.
And hopefully as a counterbalance to more salt water. Okay,
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hey, it's Scott Culbertson, everybody. I'm Executive Director of Friends of Ballona Wetlands. Neysa may have just confused you because she said SoCal Gas is going to dredge, and what she meant is California Fish and Wildlife.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I just had a question because you mentioned a lot of recreational use with bicycle paths and everything, and I was just wondering about that balance between protecting the wildlife and the wetlands and also giving places for people to be, and you know, then when dogs start coming in and things like that, just wondered how that was being handled.
Yeah, we get that question a lot. And we already have problems with folks running dogs off leash in the reserve and in other areas. So we're looking forward to the restoration, because then there will be dedicated funding for staff and wardens to patrol trails that currently don't exist. So once there are trails, it'll be easier to manage. All of the trails are on the periphery of the reserve. So all the bike trails are on the outside. And then there are some pedestrian trails that come in so you can get a closer look at the vegetation. And then there's boardwalk associated with some of the marsh areas. But Fish and Wildlife reserves the ability to block off any trails during sensitive nesting times. If there's a nest that's really close to a trail, they can block it off. And there's certain parts of the plan that don't include any trails at all. So there is also safe space that has no trails. Been great questions. And if you think of any other questions keeping you up at night, you can always email me, and I'm happy to answer after the fact. Or if you're looking for anything that's really technical that you didn't want to bore somebody with today, yeah, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to collaborate.
Does anybody have any further questions?
Just, I've never been to that area, and I know you mentioned that it's closed right now, but what would be, like, from this area, what roads? Would it be Jefferson and,
Lincoln?
I mean, to just kind of see. Okay.
Oh, yeah. So if you just kind of wanted to drive by, yeah, I would. The Lincoln, Jefferson, and Culver are the three main roads that bisect the wetlands. Jefferson and Lincoln is the very corner of the freshwater marsh, and it goes straight through Area A and Area C. But if you wanted to drive by and you can maybe see some of the tidal channels that are still bringing some water in, I would drive down Jefferson and Culver Boulevard.
Okay, thank you.
I have a hint for my Orange County friends because I'm going to Huntington Beach tomorrow, as a matter of fact. So you guys, if you just take 405 north, exit, get off at the 90. It's a little tiny freeway, and then take the Culver Boulevard exit, come down to the bottom of the off-ramp, take a left, and that'll take you right through. The bridge will take you over Lincoln. You'll go over the creek. You'll get to see the creek, and you'll be going along, as Neysa said, habitat, and then you can make a U-turn once you get to the foot of Culver. If you want to check out the beach, you could, and then go turn back and head east and veer to the right, and you'll be on Jefferson. So you could do like kind of a little loop. But the 405 to the 90, Culver exit's the way to go.
I have a question. I'm assuming, like our group, you guys are not doing public tours right now, but it sounded like you do that in healthier times. If so, where do those start, and how does one participate?
Yeah, we do public community events as well as school tours. So we bring 7,000 students through the wetlands every year, balancing out our days with Cindy at LA Audubon. And all of our salt marsh tours take off from there's a parking lot behind what we call Gordon's Market. Unfortunately, the wetlands don't have an address, so we have to give the address of the market down the street. And that's just off of Culver Boulevard, just past Nicholson, but before you get to the Vista Del Mar. And so we could give you that address. And once you get into the parking lot, you can tell because the black fence has egrets and herons and hawks emboldened on it. So it's you know that you're somewhere special. And then you'll finally see a sign, but otherwise you wouldn't know that it was tucked back there. We also do tours at the freshwater marsh. And once we are allowed to safely do social distance tours again, we will start that up. And but we are in the meantime working on a virtual tour. So hopefully we'll have that sooner rather than later. And I will be sure to invite all of you to that once we get that up and going.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
And I'd just like to add to that the second we're up and running and we can do safely distance hikes again once the county gives us the green light, absolutely we would invite you to come up and take a tour with us, and we would love to see you.
I went and visited Bolsa Chica for the first time ever, I think a year and a half or 2 years ago, as a staff field trip. And we went in the summer and we got to see the California least terns. And I was so jealous. Just everywhere. Like I thought I was going to get hit in the head with them. It's so incredible. So yeah, I was grateful to explore your marsh, and we'd love for you guys to come and explore ours.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much for speaking on behalf of Ballona Wetlands. It was really great to hear about all the work being done there and the success stories, and it's just super cool to hear about different organizations like working together for a common goal. So thank you. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you. Yeah. Happy to be here, and so proud of all that your organization is doing and all your volunteers. So keep defending the wetlands.
Wait, Elliot has his hand raised.
Oh.
We did.
It was I was clapping. I was saying good job.
Oh, okay.
I actually had a quick question though. Any kind of restoration efforts in conjunction with the dunes on the backside of LAX?
So that's managed by the Bay Foundation, and they usually have volunteer events as well, which are also on hold, though I think they're still going out there with their staff and interns and doing what they can. But yeah, that's managed by the Bay Foundation, and there's still an ongoing project.